And welcome, illustrious students, to Programming 3. We are going to start our course with some Programming 2 review. We're not going to go over the stuff from Programming 1 again because at this point you should have a pretty firm foundation on those concepts. But I do want to kind of touch up on some of the things that we talked about. I'm not going to go too in-depth into them because, again, that was the last course. But I just want to kind of give you a brief recap of some of the things we talked about. So first thing we want to talk about is file input-output. So with file input output, remember one of the things that we want to do a lot of times is write to a file. Rather than just writing to the console, we want to actually, let's say, write to a text file or binary file. For our purposes, we're going to keep it simple and just talk about text files. So when you're outputting to a file, you need to use the java.io library, IO meaning input output. When you import each individual class and exception, you can do that, or you can also use the acceptable java.io.star to just import the entire library. All right, it's up to you which you want to do. So you can import, the file reader, file io.exception. You can import all those individually, or you can use the asterisk there to import the entire library. Now, when you're writing to a file, you should include the code inside a relevant try-catch block, so that if the program encounters an error when you're writing to the file, it will not immediately terminate your program with an error. Right. Now, note this doesn't mean necessarily the whole output stream has to be encapsulated within the try block, as you can see within the examples I provided. However, at least a portion of your code, which is particularly the one where it has to access the file, that's the portion that needs to be in the try-catch block. Now, Java, of course, does this with the print writer class. That's how it writes out to the file. Right. There's multiple ways of reading files, which we'll talk about in a minute, but pretty much just one way to write, which is print writer. Now, print writer doesn't actually technically write to the file itself. All right, you have to use file output stream to actually output the file. So print writer helps you just access the file. File output stream is what actually does the writing to the file. Now, an example program is provided in the class materials. I'm going to look at all the example programs here at the end, so let's just keep moving on. So now we talk about writing, let's talk about reading. Reading from a text file, we have what's known as the buffered reader. This is an older class in Java before we got to the scanner class, which we'll talk about in a minute. But buffered reader is still a very acceptable way of reading in input. So, as I mentioned, it's a reason input. You typically have two ways of doing this. You have readline, which just reads the next line, and it's going to keep doing this until you reach the end of file, which in case it will say null. All right, so the value of return will be null rather than being some kind of string. Whereas you have read, which is going to read in the next character, and that's going to return -1 if there isn't another int in the file. Now note, because it's int, you have to typecast if you want something to char. Buffer reader must also use the file reader class in order to identify the file it's going to be parsing. So you can't just say buffer reader and then give the name of the file. It's like buffer reader, parentheses, file reader, blah 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 blah. All right, and again, we'll see this in the class materials when we look at this to kind of help illustrate how these work. Now, I've already mentioned that there is one other way of reading, and that is using the scanner class. The scanner class is, in my opinion, a little bit better way. Buffer reader is still perfectly acceptable, and there's some instances where you might prefer to use buffer reader over the scanner. But for my purposes, a lot of what I do, scanner class will work just fine. It's a little bit more user-friendly for what I do. And I'm more familiar with it, so a lot of times I'll default to what I'm more familiar with. So the scanner class is a lot of times what I will use. And it's often, in some ways, an easier approach because, well, for one, you don't have to have this long name called buffered reader. So many of the methods with scanner class, another advantage of it is that they also behave the same way as they would for regular console user input. So whether I'm reading from a text file or I am reading from the user inputting values on the console, they're going to behave the same. So for example, readline reads in a line text. And it can do that from either the text file or it can do that from user input. So they behave the same way. And that's one of the reasons why I prefer scanner over buffered reader, because I don't have to try and remember any kind of nuances. Now you're still going to need the file input stream to identify the file you're going to be scanning. Scanner is not different than buffered reader in that aspect. It still needs to know what it is. So when you create your scanner, you'll say, new scanner, parentheses, file input stream, and give it its name. Now, that example, again, is looked at in the class materials. So let's go ahead and look at those examples now. Now you'll notice that this is stuff from Programming 2 because these are still perfectly viable examples to look at for a recap. So in here we have our first one, which is the file output stream. So this is writing to a file. Here I have my print writer. I just created it. It's called output stream. I initialize it to null because I don't want to give it a value right off the bat. Then I have my try catch block. You notice the try is looking to write to this file here. Right? You put the catch here, a file not found exception, which of course, if there is an error in trying to open or access that file for some reason, it's going to say error opening it. Yes, you could have it shut down to still have, you could have it branch out to something else. Like if you didn't want it to exit, you could have it move to a different part of the program. For this demo, I'm closing the program, but you don't have to do that. But the nice thing about this is that at least it tells me why did I have an error, all right, by putting the exception in there. All right, then it writes to the file. All right, you'll notice now here's this output stream.println, output stream.println, output stream.close. One thing you're going to make sure is that this part right here, all right, I'm just going to leave that in there for a second. That part right there is very important. Whenever you're dealing with streams, is make sure you close them, because if you don't close them, you can encounter some weird kind of vague things, particularly with like how memory gets handled. So please make sure when you're done with your stream that you close it. So this one will write to the file, the quick brown fox jumps to the lazy dog, closes it, and then of course the program. Now of course if I were to open up the stuff.txt file after running this, you would see it says the quick brown fox on one line, jumps to the lazy dog on another. Now if I made these print instead of print line statements, obviously you can understand how that would work as well. If I switch over to now the file input demo, you can see here I am using buffer reader. Now you'll notice with this one, everything is pretty much inside of a try block, all right, which is a little bit of a change from the previous slide. And then you have our two catch blocks here. You have a file not found exception, which is where it looks to see if that file is there. If it exists, great. If it doesn't exist, might be having this happen. So was not found or could not be opened. You also have an IO exception, which is an error reading from, because here we're trying to read from the file. The first one simply just says, hey, does the file exist or can I access it? The second exception says, I don't have the ability to read what's there. It's gibberish to me. So here, buffer reader, input stream, use new buffer reader. Remember how I said we need that file reader? So you put in here a new file reader, and inside that, you'll put whatever you want the file name to be. So if it's a text file, you'll put like more stuff.txt. Here's my stream line, equals input stream.readLine. So this right here is just going to read in whatever that first line is in the text file and store it in line. Then I outprint that. Then line equals input stream.readLine. So then of course, second line of the file is printed out. Then I close the input stream. Again, very important to close this. Now obviously if you want to like display everything in here, that would be in that file. Easy way to handle that is with a loop. You could just use like a while loop or a for loop, whatever you want to do. For example, if you know the number of iterations, you can just say, hey, it's the first 10 lines in the file. I only need to make that loop go 10 times. Assuming that the file doesn't run out of space, that there's not an end of file, which we'll talk about using text of end of file. I'm not actually going to go too much into that, but with the end of file, you just handle that. I'll leave the demo in the class materials for you, so if you have questions on how to handle an end of file, you'll be able to do that. All right, now if we look at the scanner, you'll see this one, it's not the same program. I could rewrite the text file input demo for the first screen into this one, but I'm not going to for this. Instead, I'm going to here, it says, I'm going to read 3 numbers in a line of text from the file more stuff.txt. So you can see the scanner object is initialized outside of the try block. Compare that to buffer reader where it has to be inside of it. And then of course input stream, you'll notice is new scanner file, file input stream. All right, so again, this has to be inside a scanner, just like it has to be for buffer reader. Then you've got our catch, and then you'll notice all this happens outside of the try catch block. With the buffer reader, it didn't. It all had to be inside. So there are some advantages to using scanner. Now, here of course you have input stream.next int, next line, and then of course string line goes input stream.next line. The 3 numbers rather than text file are blah blah blah, and you can see it runs. And of course, what is the very thing at the end? We close the input stream. Now, technically, if I didn't have this here and I just closed my program, would it cause any issues? No, because the program is terminated. But it's a good practice to always make sure that you're closing your input streams. All right, that should about wrap it up, folks. I know there's kind of a lot I threw at you. Um, Hopefully these examples help give you some good idea of where to go next. So that's going to wrap up what we have for our first recap lesson, and I will see you the next time.